Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the event Authoritarianism and Social Control in Museveni's Uganda. This event marks the launch of a new book by Rebecca Tapscott, Arbitrary States, Social Control and Modern Authoritarianism in Museveni's Uganda. The event is organized by the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa and the Center for Public Authority and International Development at the London School of Economics. And thank you to those for organizing it. I'm Alex de Waal. I'm the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. I'm also a professorial fellow at the London School of Economics. The focus of our discussion today is a unique and very interesting analysis, a granular analysis of modern authoritarianism, how authoritarian governance is experienced and how it is practiced in contemporary Uganda. Political scientists, that is, scholars in the wider sense of social scientists who study politics, who break out of the rather rigid confines of rather conventional political science, particularly here in the United States, have abandoned many of those old stultifying frameworks and assumptions that have dominated the field. And those who study countries at the margins of the international order, and especially those who study the practices of power and governance at the margins of those marginal countries, often have the sharpest insights into what states really are and what the realities of such states tell us about the wider state of the world. And Rebecca's book is a fabulous example of this. It allows us to make sense of some extraordinary complexities and also some indeterminacies, I would say, in governance. It's an exploration of the institutionalization of forms of governance that may appear chaotic or may simply reflect or maybe seem to reflect a weak or collapsing state, a fragile state in the common but misleading parlance of international development praxis. And I'm be intrigued to hear what Rebecca and others have to say about modern authoritarianism, why this is a particularly modern form. So let me introduce our speakers. First of all, Rebecca Tapscott. She has a PhD from the Fletcher School here at Tufts. I had the privilege of being on her committee. She's now a postdoctoral research fellow at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And she's a research fellow at the LSE Center for Public Authority and International Development. And she is visiting fellow in the University of Edinburgh. Her work focuses on the relationship between violence and governance in illiberal democratic regimes. And we will be hearing a lot more about that in just a moment. Professor Aili Mari Tripp is Wangari Maathai Professor of Political Science and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research is focused on gender, women and politics, women's movements in Africa, transnational feminism, African politics, and the informal economy in Africa. Her most recent book is a comparative study of women's rights and legal reform in North Africa, Seeking Legitimacy, Why Arab Autocracies Adopt Women's Rights. And she has written a number of other books as well. Dr. Jude Kagoro has a PhD in sociology from Bayreuth University in Germany. And over the last few years, he's been working as a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Intercultural and International Studies in Bremen University in Germany, and is currently the head of the research project, Figurations of Internationalized Rule in Africa. He worked previously on the Policing in Africa project, and he has completed consultancies with the Rwanda National Police and the Ugandan Police Force. And a few years ago, he was awarded the Golden Jubilee Award by Uganda's President, Yoweri Museveni, for his contributions towards the professionalization of the Uganda police force. So I'm sure you will have important insights into this topic. Unfortunately, the third advertised panelist, Catherine Wajiaku-Dahu, is unable to attend, but that will give us more time for questions and answers. So First of all, I will turn over to Rebecca for a presentation. Then the two discussants will respond, and we will have a conversation among ourselves. And of course, there will be plenty of time for questions from those of you who are joining. Please put your questions in writing using the Q&A function, and then I will put them to Rebecca or the other panelists as required. So welcome, and over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. And, thank you so much to Aili and Jude for being here, and Alex for chairing this event, as well as to the Firoz Lalji Center for organizing everything. I'm really, really pleased to be here today. And so I thought I'd start with just a brief presentation of the book to give some context to those of you who might not have had a chance to look at it. It is available for free online. So if you follow the link that Lawrence has put into the chat, you should be able to download it if you would like to do so. And so this book really tries to provide a view of the state from below, and it uses micro-level data on local justice and insecurity. And these are two areas that are assumed sort of central to the authority of the state. And I looked at local and informal security actors like vigilantes and militias and how they interact with formal state actors to try to understand who can use violence and how ordinary people experience state power, and what this might tell us about how today's authoritarian regimes control their population. So early on in my fieldwork in Uganda, it became very apparent to me that the presence of the state was widely felt by ordinary Ugandans, even though it provides limited services, often across the country. So for example, during one of my first visits to Uganda in 2014, I was in a rural village interviewing a village chairman. And the man told me about rising crime rates in the village, including petty theft and fighting. And so, I asked him, well, what do you plan to do about it? And he responded that nothing could be done without the go-ahead of the higher authorities. So this sentiment appeared throughout a lot of my interviews. So for instance, one man explained to me that the government starts with ordinary citizens, me and you who are seated right here. So as told by this man, the state was not at all absent, but instead literally embodied in ordinary citizens and their daily activities and interactions. So I wanted to understand how it is that ordinary people felt state presence so strongly, even when it was not immediately present to be seen. So the book analyzes hundreds of interviews on local security and justice to contribute to recent scholarship on modern authoritarianism. And by modern authoritarianism, I really mean regimes that adopt democratic institutions and the rule of law in form, but use these institutions to loosen restraints on the executive. And this has been recognized as an increasingly central feature of authoritarianism, as seen in recent regimes ranging from Hungary and Poland to Senegal and Ecuador. So just as a quick example of what it might look like to use the law to strengthen the executive, we might think of Hungary. In 2011, Orbán's government used legal reforms to increase the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court. And this had the perverse effect of flooding the court with politically insignificant cases, making it a less effective institution overall. So I focus on how these modern authoritarian regimes work in so-called low-capacity states. And by low capacity, I really just mean that these states are unable to fully monopolize violence in a given territory and to provide basic services reliably to their citizens. And in this sense, they have limited tools to maintain control of society. Uganda is an interesting case of this modern authoritarian regime type. It's a country where the current president has, on one hand, overseen the adoption of an ambitious plan of democratic decentralization and later moves to multi-party elections. And at the same time, the regime has used acts of parliament to eliminate presidential term limits and centralize power. The executive sometimes wields power with impunity. As seen earlier this year, the country made international headlines for brutal suppression of opposition political rallies and killing tens of civilians. So here we have this combination of the rule of law and arbitrary executive power. And this dynamic poses a puzzle. How can authoritarians maintain control of a country even as they lack institutional capacity to reach all of their territory, and at the same time face democratic institutions that citizens can potentially use to demand political accountability or regime change? So my book contributes to this conversation by proposing that political unpredictability is actually central to how some of these regimes work. My research shows that this unpredictability is produced through interlocking mechanisms. First and centrally, political unpredictability results from fluid jurisdictional claims, in which state authorities sometimes assert their authority and sometimes deny it, other times leaving it ambiguous or vague. The resulting jurisdictional unpredictability makes it difficult for anyone to consolidate power autonomously from the state, because at unpredictable moments, the state may intervene to supersede them. And in other moments, state actors might fully deny their authority, pushing new and sometimes unwieldy responsibilities onto other actors who might not have the capacity to deliver. This jurisdictional fluidity is backed by meaningful threat of overwhelming and unaccountable state violence and a perception of state surveillance. And this creates a situation in which citizens perceive the state as coherent and powerful, even while they observe it as fragmented and unreliably present. The result is that democratic institutions may exist and sometimes even work as they're intended to, but that pervasive unpredictability makes these spaces precarious, limiting citizens' ability to use them to effectively hold rulers accountable. So let me give a much more concrete example of what I'm actually talking about. In one village that I researched, a vigilante group was formed to respond to high crime rates in the village. With verbal approval from the police and state authorities, the vigilantes started to patrol and implement local bylaws, and sometimes they punished those who didn't obey with beatings and fines. One day, a youth who was tired of this new regime reported to the police that the vigilantes were armed and that they were threatening passersby. In the dark of night, the police arrived and opened fire, killing one vigilante and maiming another. When the brother of the deceased reported the shooting to the police, they said that the miscommunication derived from within the village, so the matter should be solved at home, even though it's using local justice mechanisms, essentially, even though this would have meant a revenge killing against the youth who had made the false report. In the aftermath of the shooting, the group mostly dispersed and the death was never followed up. So what can these dynamics tell us about the state that we don't already know? I'm now going to zoom way out to show you why this is a novel insight that contributes to our understanding of authoritarianism as well as theories of the state. And I'll start by offering a stylized model of how our existing theories conceptualize the relationship between state institutions and enforcement capacity. And then I'll then show you how these findings point to the need for a new model. So let's start with scholarship on state formation that argues that consolidation occurs when enforcement capacity becomes linked to the institutional forms of the state, sometimes described as the state's monopoly over the legitimate use of force. So I'm depicting this here, where the state's institutions are represented by this blue circle and violence by the red center. And you can see that the two are coterminous. We can complicate this story by recognizing that in practice, states don't hold that monopoly over the use of force. Instead, subnational and transnational public and private actors use violence independently of the state. And I've depicted these non-state actors in smaller circles to the right of my larger circle reflecting the state. Theories of the post-colonial state explain how at the moment of decolonization, at least inherited state institutions, but violence remained in the metropole. So in such states, the site of real governance is outside the state, for example, with subnational actors like traditional authorities or rebel groups. And in other scenarios, elites populate the state's institutions and meld private logics of reciprocity with the public logic of a bureaucratic administration, and the state remains a facade. So these literatures on fragile and post-colonial states give us a lot of ways to think about the disjunct between the state's control of violence and state institutions. They draw attention to how violence is or is not institutionalized and where we might look to find the rules of the game. Whether these are found in formal institutions of the state or in informal social relations, we can look to them to understand and predict terms of political and economic exchange. In theory, this predictability is the foundation for a state-society relationship and the consolidation of state authority. At least in the political science subfield of new institutionalist thought, this then is the basis for the eventual emergence of democratic accountability. Importantly, these models see change as a source of instability because it makes the terms of exchange unpredictable. The natural process then would be a change to sort of readjust to a more stable and predictable status quo. My book tries to address these points by developing a model that sees the relationship between the state and its control over violence as dynamic. And I've called this arbitrary governance. Arbitrary governance allows us to look at what happens when institutions are repeatedly decoupled and recoupled to enforcement capacity in unexpected ways, and to identify some important implications for authoritarianism and conflict processes. So in this model, we have the state as the largest blue circle. And I'll just note here that the centrality of the state is not an analytic claim, but rather an empirical claim reflecting the important role of the state in Uganda. There are also elites who wield their own discrete power, for instance, through ethnic ties. And these elites might also be political actors, so I visualize them here as inside the state. And then there are a host of non-state actors organized outside the state. The vigilante group discussed in the example might be here. So in this model, state institutions can extend beyond the boundaries of the state's institutions in moments that the regime treats as exceptional. The space that non-state authorities have to operate is defined in relation to the state's violence. And so this assertion of state violence disorganizes them. In the case that I briefly outlined, this would be, for instance, when state authorities appeared and unexpectedly shot at the vigilantes. And this unexpected, violent, and unaccountable intervention caused the vigilantes to stop most of their work. We could depict this as the group fragmenting and falling apart, like so. State actors can also deny their authority, illustrated here in the reduction of state violence and capacity. And this reflects moments of non-enforcement, like when the police denied both their capacity and jurisdictional authority in the aftermath of the shooting. New non-state actors might emerge to fill the gap left when the state retreats, repeating again the process when the vigilante group was formed in the apparent absence of state capacity. As the vigilante group did, they might attempt to consolidate authority, enforcing bylaws, collecting taxes, and so on. But their consolidation remains precarious because of the constant possibility of unexpected state intervention or non-intervention. And so the relationship between violence and rules is in constant motion. The unpredictable decoupling and recoupling and over and under supply of state violence prevents would-be local authorities from consolidating power. This allows the state to simultaneously outsource day-to-day governance tasks to non-state authorities while keeping them fragmented and weak. The visible effect isn't chaos, but rather a fragile equilibrium. And so this then is what I've called arbitrary governance. The results of this fluid relationship between institutions and enforcement capacity shape the public sphere. As described by one civil society actor in northern Uganda, we have this unusual space. I wouldn't say it's safe, but we have the freedom to talk. It's not like in Amin's days, who is known for saying you have freedom of speech, but I cannot guarantee your freedom after speech. So this model explains how authoritarians can govern in weak states and in spite of democratic institutions without necessarily transitioning to state consolidation or state failure. In particular, it highlights how authoritarianism works not just by crushing opposition and extending unquestioned control, but instead through a type of management of opposition. While I'd not propose that the concept of arbitrary governance travels without modification, I think it can nonetheless help understand new forms of authoritarianism that we're seeing worldwide. For example, it offers insights into other post-liberation African states with authoritarian regimes like Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Zimbabwe, and I look at these countries briefly in the book. But what I see as one of the major insights is the importance of jurisdictional fluidity for the practice of modern authoritarianism today. And that's sort of a direction that I hope to take my research in the future. And so I'll conclude there for now. And thank you again so much. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was wonderful. Let me ask Aili to respond.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for inviting me to this program. First, I'd like to just start off by congratulating Rebecca Tapscott on her very thoughtful and thought-provoking book on a very important subject, very timely. The book Arbitrary States does a magnificent job of focusing on a key aspect of contemporary authoritarian rule, the arbitrary nature of these states, which in Uganda she describes as institutionalized arbitrariness. She does an excellent job of describing the use of political disorder in order to achieve regime stability and project authoritarian power. She argues that the regime isn't just clinging to power, they're progressively developing resilient systems of rule to dominate society and project control. This means that the state is unpredictably present and absent, sometimes intervening and sometimes not. The book effectively suggests that arbitrary rule might be not only the means of governing, but also the end goal. It is an unstable position between direct and decentralized rule, maintaining just enough consolidated control to retain power without expending resources that one might associate with direct rule. There's just enough hearing of grievances, just enough threat of state violence, just enough destabilization of expectations to keep civil society from challenging the central state. This maintains the centrality of the regime as the most important authority. The book argues that the regime fragments other sites of power, but does not destroy them. It sits like an umbrella over a host of other competing public authorities. In many ways, this is what I was trying to get at in a different way in my 2010 book, Museveni's Uganda, in which I talk about the paradoxes of power in Uganda, which are fraught with contradictions. Leaders adopt the trappings of democracy, yet they pervert democracy, sometimes through patronage and largesse, other times through violence and repression, for the sole purpose of remaining in power. When I wrote the book, I described Uganda as a hybrid regime where repression of civil and political liberties was arbitrary, yet there was recourse to a legal system. I'm not so sure anymore that Uganda is a hybrid regime. It seems to have moved into the authoritarian slot rather decisively because nothing dislodges Museveni or the NRM from power. So Rachel's book raises a number of questions for me that I think might be worth exploring in our discussion. The book says that governance through unpredictability is not merely a result of the state's weak capacity, rather it's an approach to authoritarianism today. And I'm curious, and that this is a modern approach to authoritarianism. I'm curious what makes it modern. Isn't this a classic tool of authoritarianism in general, keeping people on their toes? In 1933, Stalin, for example, released many people from prison who were convicted of minor offenses and told the security forces not to carry out any further arrests or deportations. Meanwhile, continuing to kill targeted people in the party. And then eventually the Great Purge, which involved regular courts. In this, 76,000 people were executed. And then later, ethnic cleansing of non-Soviet groups in which 700,000 were shot. This was all arbitrary, but it went through the court system. The charges were all, mostly, mostly trumped up. So I'm curious, what's modern about this strategy? What do we mean by modern? How did this strategy evolve? Where did it come from? How is it different than what we saw under Idi Amin or Obote, and under Obote, the violence was perhaps even more random than Idi Amin, who kind of went after specific groups. Was it institutionalized under Amin and Obote, and in what way? What are the colonial origins of these strategies, and how are they different? So if you look at the issue of the extra-legal security forces, that has a long history in Uganda. The presence of these groups started under the British. They trained the paramilitary special force that was used specifically to suppress dissenters. And then they continued after independence. Special forces remained, and then Obote added another secret paramilitary force, the General Service Unit. Obote also used the youth wing of the UPC, the Uganda People's Congress Party, to carry out various forms of terror. The General Service Unit then became the State Research Bureau, which was notorious under Idi Amin's time for torturing and killing people. And then these continued, and under Museveni, they evolved into a whole series of Kalangala action plans, civil defense team, joint anti-terrorism task force, Black Mamba squad, and on and on and on. And they kept evolving and disappearing, and new ones formed. So these are not new, but the number of them expanded under Museveni. And these other regimes were, more arbitrary. There wasn't, so anyway, so how is the arbitrariness different now? How should we think about the pushback against these strategies? I think in Rachel's account there, it's very weak, and I think that's an accurate description. But what about the role of the courts and the pushback from the courts? What about the role of civil society? What about the role of the press? How is that evolved, and how is that different from the past? When we talk about arbitrariness and being institutionalized, how arbitrary is it? And are there some patterns that we can discern? In other words, if it's institutionalized, then that suggests that there's some predictability here. So what are the scope conditions here? Under what conditions are we likely to see this kind of violence, state violence? Are there instances in which this repression is predictable? I mean, I think if you were an opposition candidate and you were a leading opposition candidate in an election period, you could perhaps count on violence. It's not so surprising after what we've seen with Besigye and then Bobby Wine. And so what's arbitrary? Because we know what's going to happen. So what are there patterns? Are there certain things you can count on? If you were to protest without a permit, you'll be arrested. You will be. I mean, we know that. So, what's institutionalized here and what's not? Is the arbitrary violence used differently with different groups? The book does a great job of talking about, looks comparatively at several regions. But it notes that ethnicity did not emerge as a salient factor in civilian perceptions of arbitrary governance. I guess for me, I'm curious about that, and I find it a little bit surprising because, I'm wondered if all people are treated the same. If you look at Afrobarometer surveys, people answer questions quite differently depending on what part of the country they're from. And some of these explanations are not easy to figure out. But if you, for example, ask, do they trust the police? They don't trust the police very much in the central region, in the Uganda, but one of the highest percentages of support for police is in the north, in the Acholi region, in the Gulu area. And then if you look by ethnicity, in terms of support for the government, the Baganda had the lowest trust, 9% trust of the government. Acholi had the highest, well, among the highest, 51%, and the Mugwera 60%, so even higher. So what accounts for some of these disparities if there isn't a different perception of trust in the police and in the government? And then finally, I think, what other tactics do the authoritarian regimes have in their toolbox? Arbitrariness is one, but they have a lot of tools. What about the carrot? What about patronage? What about the ethnic card? What about the instrumentalization of women's rights and using women and women leaders in an instrumental way? What about buying off the military and letting them at different times, plunder the Congo, take land in the north, create fake payrolls with ghost soldiers and other such scams? Aren't those different strategies? Co-opting people into leadership, diversionary tactics like the whole, anti-homosexuality issue. So how do we fit the arbitrary aspect into all these other, the arbitrary violence into all these other strategies that the regime uses? I have a lot of other questions, but these are just a few that the book elicited in me, and I'll be eager to discuss them with Rachel. But thank you again, Rachel, for Did I say Rachel? No, Rebecca. I'm so sorry. I don't know where I got that from, but thank you, Rebecca, for the wonderful book. And it really has been inspirational to read. So.
Sorry, I muted myself. So Rebecca, we'll let Jude make his comments, but there's a lot of things for you to pick up on there, and I'm sure you may have some questions back to Aili as well. But Jude, over to you.
Thank you. Good. Yeah. Thank you very much. Actually, I'm very happy to meet you all, and greetings from Kampala, where I'm seated right now. Unfortunately, today we had a terror attack, and a few lives were lost. Yeah, I also, first and foremost, would like to congratulate Rebecca for putting together this amazing book, which provides us with a fresh perspective of understanding Uganda's political system. And as a Ugandan, born and raised in Uganda, and an academic who predominantly researches on Uganda, I relate with the findings of this book, which actually mirror my own understanding of politics and security in Uganda, how the two actually work together. And I believe many observers and scholars on Uganda will find this book reflecting the empirical realities on the ground in Uganda. I found some amazing statements in the book, like on page 18, a common refrain among respondents across the country was, when it comes to government, things have been confusing. This I actually find quite interesting, because I relate with, and things I did very confusing, not only to the people outside the system, but also people deep inside the system, including NRM politicians and security operatives within the system. This book is interesting in many dimensions, and I actually enjoyed reading it a lot, and providing some new lenses to understanding Museveni's Uganda, and using Uganda as a unit of analysis into understanding new forms of authoritarianism observed around the world. I find the approach taken very inspiring, in that Rebecca discusses authoritarianism from the micro perspective. In other words, how authoritarianism works from below, using vigilantes, data from the vigilantes, crime preventers, to provide us a fresh perspective of understanding authoritarianism and how it works actually in the day-to-day life, in the everyday life. And of course, this, to me, at least, is a break from the scholarship that overtly concentrates on the macro perspective when trying to describe authoritarianism. The book places you, and taking the micro perspective, but at the same time placing Uganda in a global debate on the new forms of authoritarianism. I found that balance quite interesting, and at the same time bringing in some comparative perspectives drawn from similar regimes, so to say, at least Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe. This for me was also very interesting. But it was also particularly encouraging to see the cases, the research sites that Rebecca selected. I found it Gulu in northern Uganda, which until recently was anti-NRM predominantly and emerging from war. And you also go to another place like in Mbarara, for instance, which is traditionally a stronghold of the NRM, and having also it is very largely peaceful, and you still find the same patterns of how the system is actually work. And here, a lot. For instance, you were in Uganda recently, as recent as 2018, but things are changing a lot. And for instance, GUL, which was anti or predominantly opposition, is fast changing into the stronghold of the NRM. And that is also interesting for us here. Of course, this book also contributes heavily to the ongoing debates of new forms of authoritarianism. And I think here it's very interesting. What I found interesting was that the system concentrates on weakening the competition weakening the competition rather than maximizing control. And I think this President Museveni and the NRM has done very well, presenting themselves as the guardians of democracy, and I think going overtly to maximize control would mean the democratic facade would actually collapse. In this book, we have seen that Uganda definitely has these pockets of civil organizations and pathways for citizens that make claims on the state do exist. But at the same time, these spaces are fragile because the state intervenes violently and unpredictably. And I would agree here with Professor Tripp that Uganda is actually quickly shifting from the hybrid that she described in her 2010 book to actually full authoritarianism, especially if we look at the most recent elections, if we analyze the most recent elections. As Rebecca points out, which I find also very interesting, that the military, the regime and the state is very strong. I mean, the link is very strong. And for instance, she points out very well in the book that wearing military boots alone is a signal of alliance to the NRM and the link to state power. Also in my own works, this features prominently. And I would add here that also perhaps, or add the three, the state, the security system, and the NRM, we can also add Museveni as an individual. Sometimes very difficult to separate him from the security forces and the NRM as a party. And it's interesting to learn from this book how the narrative that has the NRM has sustained the narrative for many years, 35 years of how it has brought peace and presenting itself as a bridge between insecurity and security, and using all these strategies to hold on to power, and then projecting any attempts at unseating the regime or clamping together opposition and security. I mean, opposition and rebel groups, for instance, as security threats. And this has also come out quite strongly in this book. I like the fact that in this book it also comes out clearly that Museveni seems to be playing three games in one. He's bumping off the opposition, at the same time containing ambitions within the same NRM system, at the same time also trying very hard to keep friends with international actors that matter, the US and Europe in particular. And this has been sustained quite well. What I find interesting also is that the same system that has been seen in the past to have destroyed certain communities or brought war or disorganized these communities at the same time turns the same communities into pro-NRM zones that I like a lot. And then There is something I like very much about what Rebecca is presenting to us here is that this book is presenting Uganda and also Africa in general, not as an exotic case. It's not so different from, for instance, the West. And I would like to point out one interesting sentence here that I can read directly. While I make no claim to external validity of arbitrary governance at this level, I propose that developed countries are not exempt from these new and evolving strategies of authoritarian rule. That is on page 190. Now, I think we as scholars of African political system need to take this statement seriously, and that Africa is not profoundly unique. And what we observe might only be different in form and not in essence. And also using the terminology that Rebecca draws to our attention, pockets of rule, for instance, using the police in the United States and the strategies of suppression against poor, racial minorities and migrants, yet allowing other parts of society to mobilize and participate freely, using this as one of those interesting angles that, well, look here, also in other communities, especially in the West, some of these tendencies that we are observing in Africa and in Uganda in particular exist there. Well, I also have a few questions coming from this book. First, I was actually very surprised that, for instance, Rebecca found that in Imbarara, a stronghold of the NRM, people were more conscious. People were more conscious. People feared more that the state is watching or listening to them than in other places, like in the north. I found this quite surprising because I would think it would be the other way around. At the same time, perhaps, I don't know the timing here, when this was happening exactly. Perhaps it could have been influenced by the elections of 2016, when the NRM broke into two, and people were extremely very careful in those NRM strongholds, because no one wanted to be associated with the Mbabazi because it was a little dangerous. Also, there are other aspects that I also struggle with. I don't know, for instance, the description of the crime preventers in Uganda. This scheme, I don't know when to call it state, if it is a system of the state, or if it was a scheme that was put in place by a state, or it was an individual scheme from the Inspector General of Police then, Kale Kaihura, and how we separate the two, because the same scheme, from my own understanding, was very hated by the police itself. The police is the mother of this, was the mother of this crime preventer scheme, but at the same time, police commanders hated it so much because it disorganized the police system. It led to suspension, dismissal, and losing of lucrative position by many police officers faced lots of problems with crime prevention system. And also at the same time, we see that the same was hated by many pro-NRM politicians who thought that it was giving Kaihura, the former Inspector General of Police, credency, and at the same time, it was becoming a threat. And yet the same system that we're describing it turned on its very person, that is General Kale Kaihura, because it was seen that he had created a very, as you describe in the book, very extensive network, and other individuals thought that this was going to be very dangerous because he was creating some sort of political base that might be very dangerous for the system. And The other surprise that I saw was these bylaws in different communities. You describe some bylaws in Lira, for instance, where a local council chairman and his community come up with some rules of punishing people who don't participate in community work, and also those who don't send children to school. I found it actually rather surprising because Ugandans are very unruly, at least, and at the same time, well, it sounded more Rwandan than Ugandan, and I'm also learning from here. Perhaps you can throw more light. The last question for now is, I want to know, you described very well the absence and the presence of the state. That unpredictability, anytime the state comes back, it is absent at the same time present. And sometimes, yes, I agree 100% that sometimes the communities are over-policed, especially when political stakes are very high, and sometimes they are under-policed, or the absence is actually felt. I would like to take your to know your perspective here. How much is this by design? How much is it by default? Is it very systematic that the system actually has systematically gets absent and systematically comes back, or some of these things happen by default? But once again, I really appreciate this book very much. I learned a lot, and I congratulate you. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much. So, Rebecca, you have a lot on your plate, and so do you want to? I will hand it over to you and leave it to your discretion what you would really like to focus on in responding.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you for these really thoughtful and detailed comments from two scholars whose work I very much admire and really shaped my own thinking during fieldwork, during writing and analysis. So, again, it's really an honor. I'll just pick up a couple of small themes that kind of stuck out to me as really resonant with kind of what I was thinking about, or places to clarify perhaps as well. So one of them is on the ethnicity question. I see as well that there's a question about that in the chat. So I guess maybe one way to clarify in terms of what I mean in the book when I talk about perceptions of arbitrariness not being determined by ethnicity. What I really mean there is that I was struck the extent to which in the different field sites that I went to in different regions of Uganda, but also, for people of different ethnicities that I talked to in those different regions, that the vast majority of them expressed that they perceived the state as unpredictable. And I also observed similar phenomena with different kinds of, we'll call them non-state, but non-state, para-state violent actors like vigilantes and militias, where, they were simultaneously being given the responsibility to do policing and security provision activities, and at the same time being denied the authority that would allow them to kind of consolidate any sort of meaningful control autonomously from the state. So those two observations led me to sort of suggest, and as indeed as I do in the book, that people perceive the state as arbitrary in different places across the country. Now, that doesn't mean that they either see it as coming from the same source or as having the same implications. So one thing that I talk about a little bit, but that comes out in other scholars' work and that really strikes me in Uganda, is the way that the regime is able to frame itself as simultaneously sword and shield. It's simultaneously potentially a protector and a threat. And the fall of the regime is oftentimes just as frightening to people as its continued presence. And so, in a place like Mbarara, people did express, this perception of surveillance. They talked a lot about violence that they saw in other parts of the country, more so than violence that was experienced in Mbarara. So, talking about the war in the north and what happened there, and then saying, and what if this government were to fall, what would happen here? And so I hope that kind of adds a little bit of nuance and texture to the broader claim that ethnicity wasn't the key determining factor in how people experienced the arbitrariness or unpredictability of the state per se. I guess linked to that, I would sort of, in terms of thinking about whether or not there are patterns and what those patterns are, and just again emphasize that this is very much a view from below the book, right? So I'm really talking with people who are working at a local level and not elite politicians, who certainly, I think, have a better, there are, of course, certain things you can do to find yourself on the wrong side of the regime. That being said, one thing that I found when talking with more elite respondents was that the stakes of unpredictability were higher. So, you might know that you will be arrested, but you don't know the context of that, where you will be held, for how long, what kind of detention you might have, if you'll be dragged to court, repeatedly in a way that would lead to financial ruin. And that, this is a different type of unpredictability in the sense that, it's just the extent, the amount of cost associated is perhaps higher in terms of, and therefore sort of keeping unpredictable the experience that people have with the regime. So those are just a couple of thoughts. I guess one last one. So Jude talked about sort of absence and presence and asked whether that's kind of an intentional structure. And I think, just returning to the example of crime preventers, which I think is a helpful way to think about that kind of where this ambiguity about absence and presence might come from. And one thing that I found quite interesting in studying crime preventers was how they're simultaneously framed in different ways. So simultaneously as upstanding citizens who are just fulfilling their obligation to the government to uphold the regime and help provide security, as economic actors, so as people who are undergoing training that will make them more employable, showing their activeness and utility, and then finally sometimes as political actors, people who are trained by the police and given special knowledge that makes them unlike ordinary citizens, cotters of the regime, essentially. And that by using these three framings simultaneously and interchangeably, and by recruiting hundreds of thousands of crime preventers across the country, often in ambiguous ways, right? So, sometimes I'd say, we need 30 crime preventers in your village, and people will just fill out, the recruiter will fill out a sheet of, the people who are in the local savings and credit association, right? So it's unclear to some extent whether those people are actually actively participating in crime preventers or not. But you have essentially this perception of this massive recruitment of people who could be either, just good upstanding citizens, or people who are going to report on you to the government if you do the wrong thing. And that this creates the possible presence that can be realized potentially at any moment, but also might not really be there. Your local crime preventer might have a connection up to elite levels in the police, or might not be able to help you at all with, your experience of a local crime. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at when I'm talking about this ambiguity of presence and absence.
Thank you, Rebecca. There's one question in the chat which I want to put to you from Firoz Lalji. I hope I've got your pronunciation of your name right. Who asks, an important line of research on modern authoritarianism is the use of information technology to manipulate public opinion rather than using old-fashioned overt violence. Goriev and Tripp, 2019, call such regimes informational autocracies. And the question is, with rising digitization, do you see this as a factor at work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and really fascinating one, I think, for further and future research. One way that it did come up in my research some was in the comparative studies that I did. So it's brief, but in the conclusion, I do look at Rwanda as well as Ethiopia and Zimbabwe. And the Rwandan case is really fascinating to me, in part because of the state's ability to use surveillance capabilities in a much more sophisticated way, I think, than you see in the other cases, and certainly than in a case like Uganda, where these sort of surveillance technologies really and ability to analyze the data that is gathered from that surveillance enable the state to have much greater reach, and in that sense make the sort of arbitrariness of the state perhaps more solidified and slightly less unpredictable, right? And so this kind of goes to Aili's point as well, to what extent is this arbitrary, and in what ways? In a case like Rwanda, the state is better informed, actually, materially, of where dissent is occurring and able to target more precisely. So it'll be very interesting to see, what happens in the region as these technologies both improve, become more accessible, and become more effectively utilized by different governing actors.
Okay. There's one question that is in my mind, and Aili mentioned it, and I want to put it to you, which is resistance. I mean, to what extent are you able to see resistance either within the system or resistance against the system itself from the citizenry?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's one that I continue to come back to as I think about the project more and where resistance lies. And, when I reread different parts of the book, think about kind of the way that I've articulated different things. So I'm glad you kind of put it back on the table. One example that I think is helpful to give is from Karamoja, so the eastern border of Uganda with Kenya. And this also goes again to Aili's point about sort of, what about other strategies that the regime uses as well. So one thing that I didn't talk about very much in the presentation, but is really central to the way that the government works in Uganda, and which Jude has actually written about a lot, is the massive militarization of not just politics, but also the economy. And the way that resources flow very much through the security sector. So for instance, the government's massive national agricultural services program, extension program in 2014 was moved under control of the military to be implemented by veterans. With the justification being that, military officers are both more disciplined and they'll be more effective, and also we can give veterans some jobs. But the reason that I mentioned Karamoja is that it's a region where there's been numerous disarmament campaigns. There's lots of small arms there that have flowed in the region and often are used in cattle raiding. And when the disarmament campaigns happen, basically the government sort of forcibly disarms people, but then oftentimes will simultaneously recruit local militias to help out with this process, and also to sort of increase security around cattle at the same time. And so you'll find situations where people are forced to turn over their weapons and then sort of turn around and come to the other queue and sign up to be a militia member and get a weapon back and go back to their community, now holding this weapon as an agent of the state, whereas previously they were not. And I just think that's an interesting example of the way in which agency can become co-opted into the system, where people are acting very agentively, but given the broader context that they're working within, it oftentimes can end up sort of reinforcing or reinscribing the authority of the state. I'll just give one other very brief example, which is a recent piece that I co-authored with some of my Ugandan colleagues that's on naked protest. Actually, that also draws on some of Aili's work. So I guess lots of synergies here. But the reason that I mentioned that is part of what that piece was really trying to think about is how can people protest the regime in a context that is so highly militarized, where if you're an ordinary citizen, and as Aili pointed out, you stick your foot too far over the line, you're very likely almost certain to end up in jail or with other ramifications. And what that piece tries to do is look at alternative modes of protest and talks about how, especially around land disputes, oftentimes women will bare their naked bodies as a way of cursing authorities or people who are trying to take land away from people. And the idea there was that this is essentially an alternative vernacular, or in a way of trying to carve out a space that is not militarized in the same context, that is governed by cultural rules and by sort of social expectations of relationality. So that's a piece that's published in Civil Wars that tries to kind of take forward this question of agency and where we might find that in this kind of system.
Thank you. There's another question has come in, and I want to piggyback one of my questions actually on top of that from Jonah Lipton. Which is something you've already touched on, which is how does the arbitrariness of the state differ when looking from the top down rather than the bottom up? Does it seem more ordered? Is arbitrariness a conscious strategy of the political elite? And I want to sort of couple that with a question that I had, which I think Aili also brought up, which is how is this different to what has gone before? And could it be that the difference, perhaps, and this is a conjecture, a hypothesis that I'm putting to you, that in the past there was an ideology from the top and an expectation from the populace that the state was on a trajectory of formation, that there was some, rather different, much more institutionalized, quite better future ahead. Whereas now, we perhaps think this is the end state. This is the sort of the convergent form of authoritarian governance, not just in places like Uganda, but in what we call developed countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start, I guess, by sort of responding directly to your comment and see if I can loop back around to Jonah's. But yeah, no, I definitely agree. I mean, I think what is different about this is the relationship between law and arbitrariness and the importance of law and institutions. So the extent to which, and I mean, a lot of people have written about this, right? But it's not just that rulers are using institutions to try to sort of unjackal the executive, but they also are constrained in some different ways by the executive. And again, I think Uganda is a very interesting case of this, and also how that tension or dynamic can change over time. And, we've certainly seen different balances in Uganda, not just during Museveni's rule, but, as Aili pointed out, during Obote as well. But the extent to which, the regime is trying to manage these rules and laws and cares about them, cares about having them in place as well, not just for domestic governance, but also for international relations. So I think that is one important dynamic. And also, as you point out, people's expectations or assumptions about what will happen next and what that looks like. In terms of sort of the top down and whether it's a conscious strategy or not, I mean, actually in the book, I think I point to your work, Alex, to sort of say how difficult it is to really try to assess what it is that's in elites' minds, and how purposeful or not purposeful these kinds of strategies might be. I do sort of argue that it's not as if anybody sort of intentionally set out from the beginning to say, let's make this unpredictable and arbitrary, but rather it's sort of the sort of logic of the institutional setup, if you will, and that essentially you have all of these different competing institutions that don't completely collapse or fold into each other. They're not fully empty. They actually do work the way they're intended to at times, but just that their jurisdictions are so unpredictable that it becomes very difficult to know, which set of rules will be applied to you at any time.
Thank you. Well, we have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask Aili and Jude if they have any additional comments, and then put it back to you, Rebecca, for any concluding thoughts. So, Aili.
Yeah, no, thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion. I still would argue that this unpredictability comes from the fact that the state is very weak at the end of the day. And I think that this question of intentionality that Jude raised and that was picked up by Alex, I think that and by Jonah also, I think it's an important one, because I don't know that it's all, some of it's intentional, but I think that the reason for the arbitrariness comes from the weakness, that at the end of the day, the state cannot really doesn't have the capacity to affect society, as Joel Migdal talks about state capacity. It doesn't regulate social relationships the way it would like. It can't extract resources and tax people the way it wants, and it can't use those resources in determined ways because it keeps resorting to corruption all the time to control things. And so that's what makes it arbitrary. And that's the source of that arbitrariness. It's not strength, it's not intentionality as much as it is this weakness. And at the end of the day, and so that's, I mean, that's where I guess I would fall on that, and it may be perhaps different than where the Rebecca would situate the argument. Also, I think that the importance of ethnicity needs to be. I think it's more important than than's been suggested. I mean, the differences are huge. And again, going back to the Afrobarometer, I failed to mention. There was a question about, are you treated fairly but unfairly by the government? And for the Banyankole from the region that Museveni is from and much of the NRM top leadership is from, they said never, 82% of the time. And the Acholi, which is in the area that Rebecca did most of her work, they said 30% of the time. I mean, that's a huge difference, 30, 82. Now it sounds like from what Jude is saying that that's changing, and it would be interesting to know why it's changing, that dynamic. But still, ethnicity still matters in these ways, and it's manipulated by, I mean, by the NRM in a variety of ways. Deliberately, and again, it comes out of its own weakness. It wanted to have this broad-based system, but that never really happened. And if you look at who's in the military and the top people in the military, they're from the same region, from the West.
Thank you. Jude, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'll add a few things here, especially when we're trying to define Uganda in terms of strength, whether it's weak or strong, is quite slippery because depending on where you're looking from, the Ugandan state is quite strong, at the same time weak, depending on what is at stake. When we look at the security or anything that tries to disrupt the status quo, it becomes extremely strong. It's very present across the country, and you talk to 1, 2, 3 people, already the third person in the state knows what's going on, and the structures in place that have been put in place right from the local council 1, the last unit of administration, until the central government, and overlapping security structures that counterweight the political structures. Then when you're looking at from that direction, it's actually quite strong. It's very difficult to create an independent sphere of influence that counters the central government easily like that. But when it comes to delivery of services, control of corruption, and etc., I mean, like medicine and health services, it again now becomes extremely weak. Perhaps maybe that does not directly affect the status quo. But then the issue of the ethnicity, it has always played a huge role in politics of Uganda. In the past, it seems like it was the North against the South, but now it's also changing. The dynamics seem to be changing because in the last elections, I've currently done a study on the elections in 2021 elections, and that came out strongly. The ethnic undertones. Now it's no longer the South against the North. It looks like the Central is beginning to compete seriously against the West, so to say. And now the North seems to be in bed with the West. And how that has happened over time is also quite interesting. That these regions seem to be coming together to do something. I mean, like to counter what is in the central. Now, the other interesting thing, we have to understand the NRA machine right from its inception, because it has always been politically weak and militarily strong. The military or security structures have always been stronger than the political structures. And that still plays a role until the present day, because the system does not see itself as a smooth political outfit, but a very tough and warrior-like system that can contain whatever is thrown at it. At the same time, bridge insecurity with security. And you have seen a number of times the president himself presenting himself as a warrior, because that works very well for his politics. And yeah, so for now, that's all I can add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Rebecca, any concluding thoughts and reflections from your side?
I mean, I guess I would just add, I think actually these kind of concluding comments from Aili and Jude nicely set out and sort of the tensions that I think I'm trying to sort of explore and set out in the book between, a strong state and a weak state, how it is that a state that appears in some ways so weak actually is felt so intensely by people across its territory, such that they end up enacting and reproducing and creating the regime at a local level, right? And so I think that really nicely kind of sets it out. And, these dynamics of changing affinities and support for the state, I think will be really interesting to see in the coming years. I kind of try to link that to experiences of violence and coercion and repression and how that reshapes the subjectivities of different people in different places. But it's something that I would be really interested to continue to explore as well. So thank you so much again for your time and engagement with the project. It's been really a pleasure for me.
Well, thank you very much. I really encourage everyone to read the book. I hadn't realized actually it was available free. That's terrific. So please download it, read it, and we really look forward to what you're working on next, Rebecca. And thank you very much, Aili Tripp and Jude Kagoro for joining us. And thank you everyone for attending this session. It's been terrific.